Ever wonder how ideas actually spread around a company? Like
Mm.
who talks to whom, especially in places like research and development labs. It turns out someone sent us some really interesting research about this. It seems like getting this flow of knowledge right can really make or break innovation.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really fascinating. The typical org chart, while useful for seeing who's in charge, doesn't really tell us how information is truly shared. That's where this thing called social network analysis comes in, or SNA for short.
SNA, that sounds pretty technical. What is that?
It's a way to visualize relationships. But instead of like roads between cities, imagine we're talking about people and how they swap ideas. It's like you can see the threads of communication in a company.
So you're talking about mapping out who goes to whom when they need to know something.
Yeah. Exactly. And these researchers, they used SNA to look at how knowledge moves within an Indonesian R&D center. But here's the really smart part. They didn't just map one network, they mapped two, a knowledge network and a bureaucratic network. This way, they could see the difference between how info actually flows compared to how it's supposed to on paper, according to those org charts.
Now that is clever. Two networks, two perspectives.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with the knowledge network. Who's chatting with who about the research itself?
Well, that's where things get interesting. You'd think the director, the one in charge, would be at the heart of it all, right? Turns out that's not always true.
Really? You're saying the head honcho isn't necessarily calling the shots when it comes to knowledge?
Yeah. In this specific R&D center, they found the director wasn't as central to the knowledge network as you might expect. Could mean there's a disconnect, maybe crucial info from the ground level isn't making it up to those making the big decisions.
Yeah, that's a little worrying. So if the director's not the knowledge guru, who is?
Yeah.
Who are the real influencers in this R&D center?
Well, get this. The study found that non-managerial employees were actually some of the most important hubs of knowledge.
The unsung heroes of R&D. Those are the folks who really have a finger on the pulse of everything going on.
Exactly. They are the go-to people, the ones everyone trusts for the latest discoveries and information. Really makes you think about how important it is to recognize expertise at all levels of an organization, not just at the top.
Like those hidden gems. The places you wouldn't know about unless someone told you. Okay, so we've got these unsung heroes, but what about the managers? Surely they're still important in all of this, right? They're not just sitting around, are they? The managers, I mean.
Oh, not at all. They're still super important. In fact, the research found that the heads of the different research divisions, they played a vital role.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. They're the ones who can really see the bigger picture, connect the dots between those different research areas.
Exactly. But there's another layer to this whole thing. Remember those non-managerial knowledge hubs we talked about? The study found they often form these really tight-knit circles.
Like little islands of knowledge within the larger R&D world.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And on the one hand, those close-knit groups can be incredibly efficient, fosters trust, speeds up knowledge sharing, but, and this is a big but, it can also lead to those dreaded information silos.
Right, so you've got potentially groundbreaking stuff trapped within those smaller groups that never makes into the people in other teams who might actually really need to hear it.
Exactly. And that's crucial for any organization, not just R&D. You got to encourage communication and collaboration across different teams, different departments, break down those walls.
Because who knows, right? The next big thing could come from connecting ideas that you wouldn't think were related at all.
Absolutely. Now, before we get too lost in the world of research papers and labs, let's switch gears for a minute. We've got to talk about the second network those researchers mapped, the bureaucratic network.
Right. Who's talking to who? About budgets, approvals,
Yeah.
all the fun administrative stuff. I bet this network tells a very different story.
You're right about that. And while it might not sound as exciting as cutting-edge research, understanding how that administrative information flows, it's super important for understanding how an organization really functions.
Because even the most brilliant idea in the world still needs funding and resources to actually make it a reality.
Exactly. And what did they find in this R&D center? The administrative division, especially those handling the finances and general affairs, they had a much bigger impact within this network than you might think.
Well, hey, someone's got to keep the lights on, right?
Yeah.
And the research grants flowing.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show a well-oiled bureaucratic machine, it's the backbone of any successful organization, whether we like it or not.
Okay, so we know the administrative side of things seems to be ticking along. Anything else interesting from this bureaucratic network?
There is one more thing. Remember how we talked about the director not being as central in that knowledge network? Well, it turns out in the bureaucratic network, that could actually be a good thing.
Hold on, so now a hands-off director is better?
Well, in this case, it seems to imply that the director has empowered those middle managers to take charge of the day-to-day. That delegation, it can be a good sign. Means the director's not getting bogged down in the small stuff and can focus on the bigger picture, you know?
So knowing when to step back and let the team do what they do best, that can be a good thing in itself.
Exactly. And unlike that knowledge network where we saw those little groups forming, there wasn't much of that happening in the bureaucratic network.
So at least on the administrative side, the information's moving between the folks who need it.
Seems like it. But now we have these two networks, each showing us different patterns, different connections. The big question is, how do they all fit together? And what does it mean for this R&D center?
It's almost like we're looking at two sides of a coin.
Yeah, I like that.
On one side, you've got this dynamic, kind of messy world of how knowledge is actually created and shared.
Right.
And then on the flip side, you've got that very structured, efficient flow of all the administrative stuff.
Right.
But the question is, how well are these two sides actually talking to each other?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That's really what these researchers wanted to know.
Yeah.
And you know what they found? In this particular R&D center, at least, there was a pretty big mismatch between these two networks. They weren't exactly in sync. You know what I mean?
So even though everything's running smoothly on the administrative side, the really important stuff, the research, that might not be reaching the right people.
Which kind of defeats the whole purpose, right?
It does.
And it highlights something super important, I think, something that applies to pretty much any company, really.
What's that?
So much of the important knowledge sharing happens in those informal settings, you know, outside of the official channels.
Those quick chats in the hallway, those brainstorming sessions that turn into coffee breaks.
Exactly.
It's those unplanned moments where the really great ideas are born.
Yes. It's those informal connections built on trust and shared passion. Those are vital for a truly creative environment.
Makes you think, right? Do companies sometimes stifle their own innovation by being too rigid, too focused on the official channels?
It's something to consider, for sure.
Definitely.
And it brings us back to you, dear listener. We've been talking about knowledge flow in an Indonesian R&D center, but this stuff, this is universal.
Well, yeah.
These dynamics, they're happening in every single company, every team, every industry.
So true.
So as you're going about your day, just take a moment to think about the networks around you. Who are the unsung heroes in your workplace? The ones you go to for info.
The ones who really know what's going on.
Exactly. Are there knowledge silos popping up? And if so, how could you help break those down?
Yeah. How can we build those bridges?
Right. And here's a final thought. Think about those informal connections, those moments where collaboration just happens organically. How can we cultivate that within our own teams?
Because sometimes the best conversations happen not in a meeting room,
Right.
but maybe grabbing a coffee with a colleague.
Exactly.
Something for all of us to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.